When we talk about what happens to a child raised by a narcissistic mother, we are not discussing simple bad parenting. We're talking about a psychological environment that quietly shapes a child's inner world, often long before they have the language to describe what they're experiencing. A narcissistic mother does not see the child as an independent being with emotions, needs, and boundaries. Instead, the child becomes an extension of her ego, a mirror she expects to reflect her idealized image. And this distortion is where the real damage begins. Children naturally look to their parents for identity. They learn who they are by how they are seen. But when the mother's attention is conditional, given only when the child is useful, obedient, or flattering, the child learns something deeply harmful. Love must be earned. They develop a heightened sensitivity to emotional shifts, constantly monitoring the mother's tone, expressions, moods. This hypervigilance is not intuition, it is survival. The child becomes trained to anticipate chaos, to avoid triggering anger, to stay agreeable even when they feel hurt. Jung would call this the child's first encounter with the false self, a mask created to maintain harmony in an environment where authenticity feels dangerous. As they grow, this internal conflict becomes more pronounced. The child may struggle with guilt for asserting their needs or shame for wanting independence. They may become people pleasers, overly responsible, or emotionally withdrawn. Some internalize a mother's criticism and develop a harsh inner voice that echoes her judgments long after they leave the home. Others swing in the opposite direction, seeking validation from anyone who offers it, because they never learned how to validate themselves. Your role as the other parent or guiding figure is not simply to observe this dynamic, but to understand its psychological depth. This awareness is not about blaming the mother. It is about seeing the child clearly. When you recognize the emotional imprint left by narcissistic parenting, you can respond with clarity instead of frustration, insight instead of confusion. And in doing so, you become the counterforce to the child's internalized chaos. You provide the reality that balances the distortion. A child who has been misseen needs someone who truly sees them. A child who has been blamed needs someone who understands them. And a child who has been emotionally starved needs someone who consistently shows them what real connection feels like. If you can be that presence, you don't just protect the child. You help them reclaim themselves. Because every child deserves a self that wasn't built in response to someone else's wounds. When a child is growing up with a narcissistic mother, one of the most stabilizing forces you can offer is emotional safety. And this isn't about being perfect or endlessly patient. It's about being consistent in a world where the child has learned that love, attention, and acceptance can shift without warning. Think of yourself as the grounding point, the quiet center in a psychological storm the child didn't choose, but has been forced to navigate. Your steadiness becomes more than parenting. It becomes a kind of antidote. A narcissistic mother often operates from a place of emotional volatility. Her reactions may depend on how well the child aligns with her needs, her image, her narrative. The child learns that affection can disappear instantly and that criticism can arrive without cause. This creates a deep confusion. Who am I if the person who's supposed to love me changes the rules every day? And this is where your role becomes transformative. When you respond with calm, when your presence is predictable rather than reactive, the child begins to internalize a different truth, one based on reliability rather than fear. They learn that not every adult will punish them for being honest. They discover that expressing emotions isn't dangerous, that mistakes don't equal rejection. This may sound simple, but psychologically it reshapes the architecture of their inner world. Jung spoke often about the necessity of the secure container, a space in which the psyche can safely expand into its own potential. You become that container. Through your tone, your patience, your steady boundaries, you communicate something revolutionary to the child. You exist independently of her moods. Your calm teaches them that conflict can be navigated, that emotions have meaning, and that their inner experience is valid, even when someone else denies it. The child may test you at first. They might expect anger where there is none, or retreat from comfort, because they've learned not to trust it. Stay present. Your consistency is slowly rewiring patterns that have taken years to form. By showing up the same way, day after day, moment after moment, you provide the stability the narcissistic mother cannot offer, and in doing so, you help the child build a foundation strong enough to carry them into adulthood with clarity and resilience. Your presence becomes the quiet message they carry for life. You are safe, you are seen, and you are more than the chaos you were born into. Children who grow up with a narcissistic mother often develop an internal language that isn't truly their own. They learn to name their emotions based on how she reacts, not based on what they genuinely feel. Joy is acceptable only when it serves her image. Sadness is dismissed as weakness. Anger is punished. Even curiosity can be seen as rebellion. Over time, the child's inner vocabulary becomes distorted, and they begin to doubt the legitimacy of their own emotional experience. That is why teaching a child emotional literacy is not just helpful, it is essential. It gives them back a voice they were never allowed to develop. And this process doesn't begin with grand lessons. It begins with simple acknowledgments. I see you're upset. It makes sense you feel that way. Tell me what's going on inside. These small moments act like psychological mirrors. They allow the child to recognize themselves without the narcissistic filter imposed on them. When a child learns to accurately name what they feel, fear, disappointment, excitement, confusion, they take the first step out of the psychological labyrinth the narcissistic mother has created. But emotional literacy alone isn't enough. The child must also learn that their worth is something intrinsic, not a reward to be earned through perfection or compliance. This is where your role becomes deeply influential, when you praise effort instead of performance, when you appreciate honesty instead of obedience, when you celebrate individuality instead of conformity. You communicate something the narcissistic mother could not. You are valuable simply because you exist. In Jungian terms, you are helping the child reconnect with the true self, the authentic identity buried beneath layers of adaptation and survival strategies. This true self is fragile at first, hesitant, unsure whether it's safe to step into the light. Every moment of validation strengthens it. Every act of listening without judgment expands it. Every time you allow the child to feel without consequence, you're teaching them that their inner world is real, meaningful, and worthy of expression. And this teaching becomes a form of liberation. A child who understands their emotions gains clarity. A child who believes in their own worth gains freedom. With both, they begin to shape a life that is not defined by the emotional turbulence of their mother, but by the strength emerging within themselves. Because the moment a child learns to trust their own voice, the narcissist loses theirs over them. One of the most challenging parts of raising a child with a narcissistic mother is learning how to set boundaries, real boundaries, not the performative kind that narcissists often claim to respect but quietly undermine. A narcissistic mother tends to see the child not as a separate individual but as psychological property. So when you begin establishing limits, you're not just creating new rules, you're disrupting a dynamic she believes she has the right to control. And that is precisely why boundaries matter. They are not acts of aggression. They are acts of protection. Boundaries begin with clarity. You cannot control how she behaves, but you can absolutely control the environments you expose the child to, the types of conversations you allow, and the emotional access she is permitted to have. For example, if she begins using the child as a messenger, a pawn, or a source of validation, it's your responsibility to intervene. Interruption is not conflict, it is guidance. It is the conscious decision to refuse her attempts to turn the child into a psychological extension of herself. And the child notices this. They may not understand the politics of adult relationships, but they feel the shift. They feel when someone steps in for them. They feel when someone protects their emotional space. This builds trust. It teaches them that boundaries are not walls. They are doors that must be opened with respect. Without this model, the child grows up believing that no is dangerous that disagreement is betrayal, and that compliance is the safest possible identity. You are teaching them the opposite, that boundaries are an expression of selfhood, not defiance. Jung would say that boundaries are how the individual guards the sanctity of the psyche. They prevent intrusion, distortion, and the collapse of one person's identity into another's shadow. When you set boundaries with a narcissistic mother, you're not only shielding the child from manipulation, you're teaching them how to assert their own psychological sovereignty. Over time, they learn that love can exist without control, connection without fear, and relationship without sacrifice of the self. Eventually, the child begins to internalize these limits. They start applying them instinctively. They know when something feels wrong. They know when someone is crossing a line. This inner sense of protection becomes the lifelong gift you give them, because every boundary you set on the outside becomes a boundary they learn to honor on the inside. One of the most misunderstood aspects of dealing with a narcissistic parent is the need to quietly and consistently document behavior. People often assume documentation is only necessary when a situation becomes legal or dangerous, but in reality, it plays a crucial psychological role long before that. When you're dealing with someone who rewrites history, denies their own words, and shifts blame onto the nearest target, documentation becomes a counterweight to the distortion. It preserves reality, your reality, the child's reality, when the narcissistic mother tries to bend it. And it's not about building a case against her. It's about building clarity for yourself, especially when you're navigating a pattern that is designed to confuse, exhaust, and destabilize. A narcissistic mother may present herself as caring one moment and vindictive the next. She may interfere with school matters, medical decisions, or day-to-day routines, then deny she ever caused the disruption. In these moments, documentation becomes a psychological anchor. Screenshots, written summaries, saved messages, dates, times. Each one prevents her narrative from erasing the truth of what actually happened. This clarity matters because it frees you to respond, not react. When you have a clear record, you're less likely to doubt your experience or second-guess your instincts. And that steadiness directly benefits the child. They need at least one adult who does not get pulled into the narcissist's emotional vortex. A long-term protection plan, whether or not it ever becomes a legal one, allows you to step into that steadiness with confidence. It helps you prepare for school conflicts, unexpected accusations, sudden shifts in cooperation, or attempts at triangulation. When you anticipate the patterns, you're no longer surprised by them, and your response becomes strategic rather than emotional. And the child feels the difference. They sense when you are grounded, when you are thinking ahead, when you are not intimidated or thrown off balance. This gives them a sense of safety that the narcissistic mother cannot offer. They learn that adults can plan, protect, and foresee danger, not just react to it. In a home where unpredictability is normalized, your preparedness becomes a form of love. You are modeling foresight, stability, and self-respect. You are teaching the child that protection isn't paranoia, it is wisdom, because when you preserve the truth, you preserve the child. And nothing is more important than that. A child who grows up under the emotional shadow of a narcissistic mother often carries a quiet, persistent burden, the belief that they must face everything alone. Narcissistic environments don't nurture connection, they fracture it. They isolate. They teach the child that their struggles are personal failures, or that seeking help is a sign of weakness. This is why building a support system around the child isn't simply helpful. It's deeply corrective. It shows them that the world is larger than the mother's narrative, and that there are people who see them, hear them, and value them without condition. Support can take many forms. It might be a therapist who gives the child language for experiences they were never allowed to name. It might be a grandparent, an aunt, a teacher, or a coach who offers encouragement without agenda. It might be a mentor who becomes a model of healthy adulthood. These figures do more than comfort. They expand the child's psychological universe. They provide evidence that not all relationships feel like walking on cracked glass. They help the child understand that love does not need to be extracted, that affection isn't a performance, that connection can be stable, reciprocal, and safe. But building resilience isn't just about surrounding the child with good people. It's also about teaching them the inner skills that allow them to walk through the world with strength rather than fear. Resilience doesn't mean suppressing emotion or toughing it out. It means developing the capacity to face difficulties without losing yourself in them. This might involve helping the child recognize manipulation as it happens, or encouraging them to speak honestly when something feels wrong. It might mean guiding them through disappointment, showing them how to regulate stress, or teaching them that conflict can be handled without rage or retreat. In Jungian terms, resilience is the slow strengthening of the child's inner core, the emergence of a self that is not defined by chaos, but shaped by meaning. Every supportive relationship, every coping skill, every moment of reflection adds another layer to that core. And over time, the child begins to understand something profound. They are not fragile. They are not powerless. They are not destined to repeat the emotional patterns they were raised in. You are not just offering support. You are helping them build an inner foundation that the narcissistic mother cannot touch, because the strongest thing you can give a child is the unshakable belief that their future does not have to resemble their past